some of those changes are affected by human activity. And as we've talked about when we talked about genetics, we talked about artificial versus natural selection. What makes humans artificial? Well, we're not really artificial. We're part of the whole ecosystem. But we tend to do things that specifically can affect our ecosystem in a way that's very different from other animals. And things that we do that affect the global water cycle would be things like destruction of forests. When you clear cut a land, it actually very much affects how well that land will absorb water and how it uses water. Right? If there are no trees there with roots holding the soil in place, when it rains, the soil runs off. It doesn't soak in, and it's not taken up by roots. So removing forests can have a major impact on the water cycle and where the water goes. We also tend to pump a lot of water, groundwater up from the ground to use for surface irrigation. We use this for farming, and I lived in the Southwest. We use it for lawns. There's really no good reason why Las Vegas has so much greenery. It shouldn't be green. We're using that groundwater to water our lawns and for farming. With global warming, you'll get more evaporation from the surface. More evaporation from the surface means more water in the clouds. What tends to happen is where the water evaporates up into the clouds is not where it rains. As I just said a few minutes ago, the clouds move, they deposit the water somewhere else. So what global warming can do is move water from one part of the earth to another. Evaporation over the bodies of water, like the ocean, like the Great Lakes, like any of those big bodies of water, loses water from that area and deposits it somewhere else. So there's more water in the clouds, less water in the ground, or less water wherever it went into the clouds, and more water somewhere else. The big question is, what's causing this? What's causing global warming? What's causing climate change? So let me reiterate, there is no debate among scientists as to whether or not this is happening. It is. There was an intergovernmental panel in 2014 with over 1,000 scientists, thousands of scientists and policymakers from over 100 countries, which studied the climate data over the years and determined that yes, climate change is occurring. We're definitely seeing that. The general consensus is it's because of us. So the major conclusions are that global climate patterns are changing. We do see changes in the climate. In your own lifetime, there have been changes that are marked and noticeable. And that those changes are correlated with a rising concentration of carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere. So when you have that sort of a correlation, this is changing, and here is something else that is changing, they seem to be affecting each other, that's telling us that there's a high probability that those increases in carbon dioxide and other gases are related to climate change. So in investigating that, why, how could this relate, we can understand the connection between those two things. So greenhouse gases, the most important one we usually think of is carbon dioxide. Water vapor is actually a really important greenhouse gas. And the stinky thing about it is, right, when you have an increase in temperature, you have an increase in evaporation, you have more water vapor in the atmosphere, it's kind of a deadly cycle. Another greenhouse gas is methane, and this may be something you've heard of in the news over your lifetime about, oh, they're blaming it on cow farts. Have you heard that one? The idea that cows and cattle release a lot of methane into the atmosphere. Well, it is true. There's a lot of methane that's released from the average cow, but that's not necessarily the major focus of the problem. So what happens with water vapor, methane, and carbon dioxide is they create a layer in the atmosphere that both absorbs energy and radiates it back to the earth. Normally what happens, sunlight comes in through the atmosphere, hits the earth, a lot is reflected depending on what it hits. And if it hits ice, a lot of that sunlight is going to be reflected back out into the atmosphere and away from Earth. If it hits water, it tends to be absorbed more. If it hits Earth, it tends to be absorbed more, but still a lot of it is reflected back. If we have a lot of carbon dioxide, water vapor, or methane in the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane can then reflect some of the energy from the sunlight that was reflected. So sunlight comes in here, reflected up here, and normally it would just go out. But what happens is that energy gets trapped. So you have a layer in here that's heavy in carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane that reflects a lot of that energy back to the Earth. It wouldn't have necessarily done that. So it does create kind of like a blanket or a greenhouse. It absorbs some of the energy, so you've got warmer air out here in the atmosphere. A little bit goes off into space. But it also reflects energy that would normally not be reflected. That's how the greenhouse effect works. For about 650,000 years, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 didn't exceed 300 parts per million. And we can look back at ice core data. That's a really important thing. We can look at old ice and we can see how much CO2 was in that ice. That's because, as you know, as things freeze, you trap air into the water. We can do those ice core samples and see how much carbon dioxide was in there. If you follow it, you can see, oh, it's pretty steady, up and down a little bit. Get over into here when we get our Industrial Revolution, and then it shoots up. So in 2013, the average atmospheric CO2 was 396 parts per million. That's a big change. And it's continuing up. It's not done. It hasn't leveled off or anything fun like that. So CO2 concentration has changed quite a bit. Scientists are pretty confident that it's human activities that have caused this, because we understand kind of how this works. Carbon dioxide, as you know, is absorbed by photosynthetic organisms for photosynthesis. Those photosynthetic organisms make the sugars, store them, use them themselves, or are eaten, and they release oxygen. So one of the things that can happen that makes the Earth unable to absorb as much CO2 as it did in the past is maybe cutting down a lot of trees, changing the landscape. And we've done that. In order to build our cities and build our homes and build our civilization, we had to change the landscape. So that's something that can cause an increase in greenhouse gases. We've also instituted industry that uses a lot of fuels that releases greenhouse gases. So it makes sense that humans would be a major culprit of what's going on. So these are the major sources of emissions, right? Burning of wood and fossil fuels, that releases a lot of carbon dioxide. Agriculture as well releases a lot of greenhouse gases. Landfills release a lot of methane, and we talked about that last week. And then also, as I mentioned, removing those natural sinks. The sink is where you sort of sink something into. So we talk about sinking carbon dioxide into forests because they absorb CO2. The ocean can also absorb CO2 to a point, and then it gets saturated, and that doesn't work so well anymore. But these are definitely human-based activities. What happens when you have the greenhouse effect? One of the major things is warming, which I mentioned. Another one is when there's a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere, you get acidification of the oceans. So the CO2 is absorbed into the ocean. It's converted into carbonic acid, which can acidify our oceans and makes it difficult for life to survive in the oceans. Another effect is the increase of the average temperature. So as I mentioned way at the beginning, it's increased a little over a degree over the past 100 years, mostly in the last 30 years. It's projected to increase another 2 to 4.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So it's continuing. Another thing that happens is changes in weather. As I mentioned, we've got warmer. We've also got more evaporation. That changes how much water is in the clouds. And then you have more storms. Another thing that happens when you have changes in weather, changes in temperatures, that changes in weather, changes in temperatures, changes the biomes. So if the environment changes, the organisms that are there are going to be stressed. Right? That's a selective pressure. It may or may not be able to adapt to that new biome or those new conditions. So that was in the biomes and on the environment, and for some reason we separate ourselves from that, which is not really the case. But these are some significant consequences specifically for humans that can be from these changes in our climate. Food production. If you change the environment, you change what can and can't grow. If you've driven across the United States, you've seen where a lot of the food is produced. Those areas in recent years have really been suffering from either too much rain at the wrong time or not enough rain at the right time. I have family who are farmers. For some reason it seems to rain right at harvest time lately. So these changes can affect food production. Can we feed ourselves? It's also changing the availability of fresh water. We need water to survive. Everything needs water to survive. And if the water is evaporating up into the clouds and going somewhere else, we don't have access to it. These changes can also affect the structural integrity of our buildings and roads. If you've ever talked to anyone or you've ever yourself experienced what happens when maybe you cut a large tree down near your house, it's a really bad thing to do. It changes the integrity of the soil. The interaction between that tree and the water and everything in the soil stabilizes its local environment. When you change that, when you change how much water is in the soil, for instance, you change the integrity of the soil. So imagine if you have soil where you've removed a lot of water, you've removed part of the soil because the soil was holding that water. It's going to change, it's going to settle. And if you have settling underneath your house, that's not a good thing. Or the opposite. If you add water to soil, it's going to bulk it up. That also changes the integrity of our roads and our buildings and our bridges and everything else. From 1990 to 2013, we saw about a 61% increase in greenhouse gases being emitted, and they're still going. So this climate change that I've been talking about is continuing. It's happening. And it's going to continue to change. Things like these earlier springs we've been seeing. What happens when the birds come back too early? When there's not enough food? What happens if, for instance, flowers bloom at the wrong time? They're not there when the organisms that need them are there. So these changes really put a lot of pressure on the organisms in an environment, and they are continuing to change. It's incredibly fast compared to evolutionary history. Evolution is slow. It's a slow, plodding, methodical thing. If you look at the history of life on Earth, it has taken a very long time to get where we are. But climate change is very, very rapid. So changing these temperatures so quickly is a stress that's not easily met by evolution. If we continue the way we are, and usually these textbooks are pretty conservative, we're looking at as many as 30% of plants and animals facing extinction within a very short period of time. Species that have very short lifespans, like bacteria, like insects, things that produce lots of offspring in a short amount of time, can adapt more quickly, right? Because we talk about evolution in a population sense. Species that have longer lifespans, not so easily. So the ones most likely to avoid extinction are the ones that have a lot of genetic variability, right? Large gene pool. Large gene pool usually indicates larger populations. Because one of the things we talk about is when you make a population small, you reduce the gene pool. We talked about bottlenecks. You reduce the gene pool. So having a large gene pool is a benefit. Having a short lifespan so that these organisms are produced, they respond to the environment, they either live or die depending on if they have the traits that allow them to live in that new environment, and they pass on those genes quickly. That's an advantage. If you have a long lifespan and you have a small gene pool, that can be a problem. So one of the things I want you to think about as you contemplate this chapter before you come in on Monday is if there's anything that you can do as a person, we can do as a group, we can do as communities to make a difference. I'd like you to go to this website, carbonfootprint.com, and calculate your carbon footprint. Bring that to class with you on Monday. Think about ecology. Think about climate change. Think about evolution. Think about what we do in our everyday lives. And come and we'll talk about it on Monday.